Imagine for a second that the person you love most in this world is standing right in front of you, begging you to explain why you're walking away, and you look them in the eyes and choose the one sentence you know will absolutely destroy them, not because you stopped loving them, but because that's the only way you see to save them from a life of drowning with you. And then, before you can take any of it back, fate literally throws a truck in their path and you spend the rest of your life wondering if the last thing they ever felt was the lie you wrapped around your love like barbed wire. That's the emotional starting point of Dendam yang Berubah jadi Cinta, and it does not let you breathe easily after that opening choice. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. So, Dendam yang Berubah jadi Cinta, released in 2025, is one of those Indonesian dramas that slips in looking like a familiar romantic melodrama and then, episode by episode, peels back its own skin to show you all the scar tissue underneath. And what really surprises me is how confidently it leans into guilt, class, and generational debt as the foundation for a love story that's supposed to be about revenge but slowly, stubbornly, melts back into love, not in a cheesy, we're fated sense, but in that painfully human way where two people realize they never really stopped orbiting each other, they just learned how to live with a missing piece. The series, set mainly in a bustling, unnamed Indonesian city that might as well be Jakarta with its cramped alleyways, endless traffic, cheap rented rooms, and gleaming office towers, gives us Sailor and Junah, two young lovers who should have been an easy, straightforward couple, the kind of pair whose biggest problems are figuring out where to eat and how to sneak around strict parents. But no, this show asks, what if love collides head-on with the crushing reality of debt, obligation, and that deeply Southeast Asian sense of filial duty, where you don't just inherit your parents' DNA, you inherit their mistakes and their unpaid bills too, and you're expected to smile while carrying all of it. When we first meet Sailor, she's not yet the hardened, quietly fierce single mother we grow to admire. She's still just a dreamer in worn-out sneakers, a daughter of a man who gambles more than he works, a girl clinging to tiny pockets of happiness with Junah, this boy who feels like a miracle in a world that keeps shortchanging her. And the show does something really smart in those early scenes. It bathes her and Junah's memories in warm, amber light, like sunset stretching longer than they should. Motorbike rides through the city at dusk, shared street food where they laugh with their mouths full, and in those moments you can see exactly what they are fighting for, even though the fight hasn't really started yet. The drama lets them be adorable, lets them be dumb and young, lets them dream about starting a small cafe together someday, or traveling, or just getting out of the cramped neighborhood where every argument echoes through thin walls, and all of that light makes what's coming feel even heavier, because underneath it, like a soundtrack that gets a little louder each episode, we start to hear the ominous rhythm of debt collectors knocking on Sailor's door, of her father avoiding calls, of numbers on crumpled papers that just don't add up. That's one of the early strengths of Dendam yang Berubah jadi Cinta. It doesn't rush the doom, it doesn't throw the accident at us right away. Instead, it builds this incredibly lived-in sense of daily life, where Sailor is saving every spare rupiah, working part-time after class, making excuses when Junah asks why she looks tired, while Junah is in his own bubble of optimism, believing that his love and his plans are a shield strong enough to block the real world from hitting them too hard. The show's director clearly understands that revenge stories only land if we first believe what's being avenged, and across the early episodes the chemistry between Sailor and Junah feels so natural that, honestly, if you didn't know the title had the word Dendam in it, you might think you're just watching a sweet, realistic romance about two kids trying to escape poverty, and that's exactly when the noose of her father's debt tightens. The way the series reveals the full scope of that debt is quietly devastating. It's not one big dramatic scene with a gangster barging in, it's slow, humiliating erosion, rent being late, her father disappearing for nights at a time, Sailor rushing home instead of going on dates, and eventually, the debt collectors do show up, but they are not cartoon villains, they are tired men with folders and ledgers and a simple, cruel truth. Her father owes money he cannot possibly pay, and they don't really care that Sailor is in love or has exams or a life, they just care about the numbers. There's this pivotal scene where one of them, a middle-aged man with a face that looks like it's seen a lifetime of excuses, tells Sailor, "Kamu anak baik, tapi Junah enggak peduli soal itu, yang Junah tanya cuma, bisa bayar atau enggak." You're a good girl, but the world doesn't care about that, it only asks, can you pay or not, and that line echoes throughout the show, because it's the moment Sailor realizes that love is not a currency that counts in those ledgers. Junah, for his part, comes from a more stable, middle-class family, not rich by any means, but his parents have a house with actual space, a car, a sense that tomorrow is going to look a lot like today, and that security has made him bold in ways Sailor can't afford to be. He tells her, again and again, that they'll figure it out, that he can help, that maybe his parents can step in, but Sailor knows how pride works in families like hers, how dangerous it would be to let Junah's family look down on her father's weakness, and she knows that debt doesn't just threaten your bank account, it threatens your dignity, and she is already watching her father's crumble. The series doesn't fully absolve him either. Sailor's father is not some tragic saint. He lies, he hides, he gambles out of desperation and habit, and Sailor is stuck in that painful in-between place where you love someone and also see, with painful clarity, how much damage they're doing, and that emotional vocabulary becomes important when we eventually get to Junah, because part of what this story is about is learning to love people not as saviors or villains, but as flawed humans who sometimes break you even when they don't mean to. The breaking point comes when Sailor realizes that the collectors are done being patient and the threat shifts from money to bodies. They don't say it outright, but the implication hangs heavy that if the debt isn't cleared, someone is going to get hurt, and in a society where rumors travel faster than motorcycles, Sailor is terrified that Junah or his family will be pulled into this mess simply by proximity. So she makes the kind of choice that melodramas live for and real people have nightmares about. She decides to become the villain in Junah's story to protect him from becoming collateral damage in hers. The breakup scene is the first time the series really tightens the emotional screws, and it's filmed with this claustrophobic closeness. The camera sits uncomfortably near their faces as they argue in the rain outside the small cafe where they used to dream together, neon lights smearing across the wet pavement, and Junah, completely blindsided, is begging her for an explanation, any explanation that makes sense, and Sailor, shaking, chooses the nuclear option. She tells him she's tired of being poor with him, that she's met someone else who can actually offer her a future, that she never really believed in his big talk about their cafe dreams. The acting in that scene is brutal because you can see in her eyes that every word is a lie, but her voice is steady in that numb, robotic way you get when you've convinced yourself that hurting someone now is the lesser evil compared to what could happen later, and Junah's face goes through this heartbreaking collapse from confusion to disbelief to rage, and it's that rage that sets up the Dendam part of the title. What makes it so powerful is that the show doesn't give him any clue, no overheard conversation, no half-revealed truth. From his perspective, the girl who was planning a life with him yesterday has just shrugged off their love like a cheap jacket and told him that his dreams aren't good enough, and because Pride is a living, breathing character in this series, he can't just stand there and sob. He lashes out, calls her selfish, accuses her of using him, and they part with words that would haunt anyone. Semiga kamu bahagia sama wangmu, Sailor, I hope you're happy with your money, Sailor, and she, in a moment of self-defensive cruelty, shoots back something like, at least money doesn't make promises it can't keep, and that line becomes the knife they both twist inside themselves in the years to come. Right after that explosion, the show stages the accident that sits at the center of their shared trauma. Junah, shaking with anger and despair, jumps on his motorbike and speeds off into the rain, and the way it's shot feels almost like a punishment from the universe, or maybe a test. He's recklessly weaving through traffic, Sailor chasing after him on foot, screaming his name, headlights flaring, horns blaring, and then, in one terrifying slow-motion moment, a truck slams into him at an intersection. The sound design there is viciously precise. We hear the screech of tires, the crunch of metal, Sailor's scream cutting through the chaos, then a sudden, heavy silence undercut by the patter of rain, the camera lingering on the broken pieces of his bike skidding across the asphalt. It's important that the show frames this as, Nairis Tewers, he almost dies, but doesn't. For a while we're kept in the dark right along with Sailor, who is pushed aside, blamed, and eventually cut off entirely from information by Junah's furious mother. The hospital scenes are suffocating. Sailor is standing in a hallway lit by cold fluorescent lights, clutching at the door that Junah's family keeps closing in her face, while inside, doctors and nurses move around his unconscious body, and his mother, in a stunningly raw performance, spits out words that land like curses, that Sailor is the reason her son is lying there, that she doesn't want this girl from the debt-ridden family anywhere near him again, that if Sailor has any shame, she will disappear and never come back. That's another thematic thread the series pulls, how grief often looks for the nearest scapegoat, and Sailor, already drowning in guilt from the breakup and the accident, absorbs all that anger and turns it inward. convincing herself that any attempt to explain will just make things worse. Around this time, the show plants the seed of another life. Sailor discovers she is pregnant. The timing is cruel. She finds out while Junah is still in critical condition, and there's a deeply quiet scene of her in a small, dingy clinic, staring numbly at the test result, her mind clearly trying to process the absurdity of it all. How can there be something new and hopeful growing inside her when everything else feels like it's collapsing? The doctor gives her that half-rehearsed speech about options, but the show never really makes it feel like she has a choice. Sailor is the kind of person who takes responsibility even when she shouldn't, and she decides, in this tiny room, that she will keep the baby, even if that means raising it alone. The heartbreaking part is that she does at least try, one last time, to reach Junah, to tell him about the child, but the series is merciless. By the time she gathers the courage to sneak back into the hospital, maybe with the intention of writing him a letter or begging his mother to pass along a message when he wakes up, she finds the room empty. Junah has been transferred, taken away by extended family, or maybe even moved out of the city for a long recovery, and Sailor, standing in that white, sterile space where his bed used to be, realizes that not only is he gone, but she has no idea where he went, no access to that world anymore. The door has shut, and she's on the outside. That's where the series jumps ahead. Berta Huntahim comedian, several years later, and the visual language shifts. Gone are the warm, hazy tones of young love, replaced by a cooler, blur palette in the present timeline, where Sailor is now a single mother navigating life in a small rented apartment, juggling 2 jobs and the relentless chaos of raising a young child. Her daughter, or son, depending on how you interpret some scenes, let's say daughter, named Raya, is this bright, perceptive kid with Junah's eyes and Sailor's stubborn jaw, and the show uses Raya beautifully as both a source of levity and a mirror to her mother's unresolved pain. We watch Sailor wake up before dawn, pack lunchboxes, rush to a low-paying office job where her colleagues don't really know the full story of her life, and then freelance at night, maybe doing online orders or working at a cafe, all while trying to shield Raya from the worst of their financial instability. These middle episodes are where Dendam young Berubah jadi Cinta could have easily turned into poverty porn or self-pitying melodrama, but instead it grounds everything in very specific, relatable details, the way Sailor cuts coupons, the quiet shame of sending Raya to a birthday party with a cheaper gift than the other kids, the panic when the landlord hints about raising the rent, and the mixture of pride and ache when Raya draws a family picture that only has 2 people in it and says, so innocently, that maybe someday there will be a third. Sailor lies in small ways to protect her daughter's heart. She tells her that her father is working far away, rather than abandon them, and that seemingly small lie becomes another echo of that first giant lie to Junah, because the central tragedy of Sailor's character is that she keeps choosing to carry the pain alone, convinced that silence is a form of protection. Meanwhile, somewhere out there, Junah has turned his rage into rocket fuel. When we first see him in the present timeline, the contrast is jarring. Gone is the scruffy, idealistic boy with calloused hands and oversized dreams. The Junah of today steps out of a sleek car in a tailored suit, successful, self-assured, and surrounded by a small orbit of employees and admirers who know him as a sharp, disciplined businessman. The show doesn't make his success feel like a fairy tale. It's framed as an almost obsessive overcorrection. After waking up from his accident, with Sailor gone and no explanation other than the cruel words she left him with, he decided that if love and dreams could fail him that easily, then the only things worth building were power, wealth, and control. There's a montage of him grinding through rehab, then through night classes, side gigs, risky business ventures, and at every point we see that memory of the rain-soaked breakup pushing him forward, not as a tender wound but as a hard, sharp stone in his chest. Dendam here isn't about petty revenge at first, it's more like a vow carved into his identity. Never again will he be brought to his knees by someone else's choices. But then fate, or maybe just the cruel efficiency of narrative structure, brings him right back into Sailor's orbit. The way they cross paths again is both plausible and loaded with irony. Junah's company decides to invest in or acquire the small local business where Sailor works, maybe a struggling marketing firm or a boutique cafe-turned-catering service, and there's this tense, nail-biting sequence where Sailor is told that a big investor is coming to inspect operations. She spends the day stressed out, trying to make everything look presentable, unaware that the man whose future she once destroyed is about to walk through the door. When Junah finally appears, the show milks that moment for all it's worth. Time seems to slow as Sailor, carrying a stack of files or a tray of coffee, looks up and locks eyes with him for the first time in years. The camera alternates between tight close-ups, her face draining of color, his jaw tightening, a flicker of disbelief giving way to something much colder. It's one of those re-encounter scenes that's almost physically uncomfortable to watch, because both of them have rehearsed this moment in their heads 1,000 times without ever really believing it would happen, and yet here they are, standing a few feet apart in a bland office space filled with other people who have no idea that the air between these two could cut glass. Junah's first reaction is not the kind of explosive shout you might expect from a drama. Instead, it's this brittle composure that might be even scarier. His polite but distant, all business, addressing Sailor with this formal, clipped tone that might as well be a slap. You can see in her eyes that she's searching his face for any sign of the boy she loved, and instead all she finds is this mask of professionalism and a faint, almost mocking amusement when he realizes she's clearly struggling. There's a chilling line he drops, something like, "Dulu kamu bilang butuh lelaki yang bisa kasih masa depan. Lihat sekeliling, Sailor, ini masa depan yang kamu cari. You once said you needed a man who could give you a future. Look around, Sailor, is this the future you were looking for?" And you can feel how he's twisting the blade of her own lie, not knowing that he's actually stabbing straight into the truth of her sacrifice. That's when the revenge really crystallizes. Junah decides not just to ignore her, but to make her feel the same smallness and helplessness he felt years ago, yet unlike a mustache-twirling villain, he does it in ways that are disturbingly plausible in a corporate setting, overloading her with work, questioning her competence in front of others, dangling the threat of restructuring that could leave her jobless. Sailor, for her part, endures it with a mix of fear and stubborn pride. She can't afford to lose this job, not with a child at home, and more importantly, she still believes that revealing the truth about why she left him would just sound like a pathetic excuse. This tension between them is where the series really shines, because the writing understands that revenge isn't just about grand schemes, it's about tiny daily cruelties, the way you can make someone feel invisible or insignificant with just a tone of voice, and at the same time, every time Junah tries to hurt her, something in him flinches. He catches a glimpse of the same girl who once bandaged his scraped hand or laughed with him under cheap fairy lights, and the cold front cracks, just a little. That inner conflict is what slowly, almost imperceptibly, begins to melt his Dendam into something far more complicated. The wild card in all of this, of course, is Raya, their daughter, who at this point has no idea who her father is. The way the show engineers their meeting is both slightly contrived and emotionally effective. One evening, Sailor has to stay late at the office because of extra work Junah has piled on, and her usual babysitter cancels, so she reluctantly brings Raya along, instructing her to stay in a corner with a coloring book. While Sailor is in a tense meeting, Raya wanders off, lured by the glow of a vending machine or a display, and ends up lost in the semi-empty building. Junah, heading out after a long day, finds this little girl alone in the hallway, her eyes brimming with tears but trying very hard not to cry, because Sailor has clearly taught her to be strong. The scene that follows is one of the most quietly devastating in the series. He kneels down, speaks to her gently, maybe in that half-joking tone people use with kids, asking where her mother is, and there's a moment where he looks into her face and something inside him flickers, some instinctive recognition he can't explain. Raya mentions her name, her age, and maybe some little quirk or phrase that echoes something from his past with Sailor, and you can see this confusion play across his face, but before it can go anywhere, Sailor appears, panic flooding her features when she sees who is with her daughter. She quickly thanks him, a little too formally, a little too anxiously, and yanks Raya away, and that overreaction plants a seed of suspicion in Junah's mind. From there, the cat and mouse of secrets and half-truths escalates. Junah starts to notice that Raya has his eyes, his mannerisms, even some of his old phrases that Sailor must have passed on, and he becomes obsessed with the possibility that this child might be his. The series treats that suspicion with the weight it deserves. This isn't some cute, "oh, we look alike" moment, it's a potential earthquake in both their lives. When he finally confronts Sailor, it's not tender, he is furious, accusing her of hiding his own flesh and blood from him, of depriving him of years he could have spent as a father, and Sailor, backed into a corner, finally breaks. In a raw, shaking monologue, she tells him about the pregnancy, about being barred from the hospital, about showing up to an empty room, about trying to find him but slamming into wall after wall of information she had no access to, and about the decision she made to raise this child without burdening him further, especially when everyone around her seemed to believe that she had already done enough damage to his life. It's here that the show takes its biggest emotional swing, because Junah is forced to confront a brutal reality. His narrative of being the abandoned lover is incomplete at best and widely unfair at worst. Yes, Sailor lied. Yes, she chose to hurt him rather than tell the truth, but the circumstances around that choice were soaked in fear and debt and a family system that pushed her into an impossible corner, and his own family's anger created the wall that kept them apart. This is where the young Berubah jadi Cinta part of the title starts to come into focus. Love in this series isn't some pure, untouched thing. It's love that has been dragged through mud, twisted by misunderstanding, weaponized as revenge, and yet, stubbornly, it refuses to die. As they slowly unpack the years of pain between them, the show's pacing becomes almost therapeutic, conversations stretch longer, silences become heavy with meaning, and small gestures, a cup of coffee left on a desk, a shared umbrella in the rain, a text asking if Raya got home safe, start to replace the earlier, sharper jabs. One of the show's big strengths is how it uses physical space to reflect their emotional progress. Early on, every scene between Sailor and Junah is framed with barriers between them, glass walls, door frames, desks, literally anything that creates a sense of distance, but as they begin to face their past honestly, we start seeing them in more open spaces, on a rooftop, at a park where Raya plays, in the cramped but warm chaos of Sailor's apartment, where Junah, for the first time, sees the life she built without him, sees his own photos tucked into Raya's drawings, and begins to realize just how present he has been in their absence. The performances in these later episodes are quietly astonishing. You can see years of hardened anger slowly giving way to something softer, more fragile, as Junah allows himself to grieve not just the loss of what they had, but the version of himself he might have been if he had known about his daughter from the start. There's a poignant scene where he watches Raya sleep on Sailor's worn-out couch and whispers, almost to himself, "Berapa banyak pertama kali yang aku lewatkan." How many first times did I miss? And that line encapsulates the ache of his newfound fatherhood. For Sailor, the journey is about learning that martyrdom is not the same thing as love. She has spent so long believing that carrying everything alone is the only way to protect the people she loves that letting Junah in again feels like a betrayal of the story she's told herself. But she gradually understands that hiding the truth robbed him of agency just as much as his family robbed her. The show doesn't let either of them off the hook. It acknowledges Junah's cruelty in those revenge-fueled moments and Sailor's unilateral decision to erase him from his child's life, and yet, it also asks whether two people who have wounded each other this deeply can still choose each other after all the shrapnel is out on the table. One of the more subtle, powerful layers in Dendam young Berubah jadi Cinta is its portrayal of parental figures and how their failures ripple outward. Sailor's father eventually reappears in the narrative, older, chastened, and deeply ashamed, and their confrontation is a mirror to Sailor and Junah's own. She finally tells him how his debt stole her youth, her relationship, her chance at a simple happiness, and he, in a broken voice, admits that his own father did something similar to him, passing down a cycle of bad decisions and unspoken guilt. Likewise, Junah's mother has to reckon with the fact that, in trying to protect her son from the girl she blamed, she may have helped sever a bond that could have been healed earlier. These thematic echoes reinforce the idea that revenge and resentment often travel down generations, shape-shifting from debt to pride to silence, and the real act of love might be to stop the cycle, even if that means forgiving someone who never fully deserved the pedestal you put them on. As a piece of cinema or serialized streaming storytelling, the show leans heavily into atmospheric visuals and music to carry these themes. The color grading, as I mentioned, is deliberate, past scenes bathed in golden nostalgia, present-day sequences drenched in cooler blues and grays, and then, in moments where healing begins, like the first time Sailor, Junah, and Raya share a meal together at a street stall, there's this subtle return of warmth to the frame, like the show is visually signaling that the past's light is starting to bleed back into their present. The soundtrack, filled with soft piano, acoustic guitar, and the occasionally soaring string section, does a lot of emotional lifting without feeling manipulative. One recurring motif, a simple, melancholic melody that played during their early motorbike rides, comes back in a slowed, more mature arrangement when they sit side by side watching Raya play, and if you've been paying attention, that musical callback hits hard. Like the show is gently reminding you that underneath all the scars, the core of their connection is still there. Pacing-wise, Dendam yang Berubah jadi Cinta walks a fine line. Some viewers might find the middle episodes a bit slow, especially when it lingers on Sailor's daily grind or Junah's boardroom maneuvers, but I'd argue that rhythm is part of its design. The mundanity of their separate lives makes their collisions feel more consequential, and the slow drip of revelations, about the debt, about the accident, about what Junah was told while he was recovering, creates a sense of emotional mystery that keeps you invested, even when no one is crying or slamming doors. That's not to say the show is perfect. There are moments where it leans into melodramatic tropes a little too hard, overheard conversations at just the wrong moment, conveniently timed storms, but what redeems those choices is that the characters remain grounded. Sailor doesn't transform overnight from a struggling mother into some glossy, high-powered heroine. She stays a little tired, a little defensive, always practical about money, always counting bus fares in her head, and that consistency makes her gradual emotional opening feel earned. Junah doesn't flip instantly from vengeful to apologetic either. Even as he begins to understand the full picture, you see him wrestle with a decade of habit, with the identity he built around not needing anyone, and his relapses into coldness, followed by remorse, feel believable in that messy, human way real growth often looks. In terms of performances, the leads carry the entire show on their shoulders. The actress playing Sailor has this incredible ability to convey entire monologues with her eyes alone, shifting from brittle sarcasm to barely contained sobs without raising her voice, while the actor playing Junah walks that tightrope between charisma and bitterness so precisely that you understand why people in his present-day life admire him, even as you see the hollowness he's been masking. Their chemistry in the present timeline is even more interesting than in the past. It's heavier, slower, tinged with all the things they're not saying, and when they finally do share a genuine, unguarded smile again, it feels like sunlight peeking through clouds that have been there for seasons. Raya, as the emotional anchor, is never reduced to a plot device. She's given agency, thoughts, and questions of her own, and there's a heartbreakingly innocent subplot where she starts to piece together that the uncle who keeps showing up might be more than just her mother's boss, leading to one of the show's most gut punch lines when she asks Sailor, "Kalau dia ayahku, kenapa aku harus kenal dia belakangan?" If he's my father, why do I only get to know him later? The answer to that question is what the entire series is really about: how adults' attempts to protect, to control, to avoid shame, often end up creating exactly the kind of pain they were trying to shield their children from. From an audience perspective, Dendam yang Berubah jadi Cinta hit a very specific nerve, especially among viewers who grew up in similar cultural contexts, where debts, both financial and emotional, are quietly inherited and rarely spoken about openly. Discussions online after its release were full of people saying things like, "I see my parents in Sailor's father," or "I understand why Sailor lied, even though I wish she hadn't," and, maybe most interestingly, "I didn't expect to sympathize with Junah as much as I did." The show sparked debates about whether Sailor was right or wrong to hide Raya's existence, about how much blame Junah's mother bore for the years they lost, about what revenge even means when both sides are victims of a larger, broken system. For some, the ending, without spoiling every detail, might feel too forgiving, too hopeful, given everything that's happened, but I think that's where the title's promise is fulfilled. Dendam, turning into Cinta, isn't about erasing the hurt, it's about choosing, deliberately, to stop letting that hurt be the only story. By the time we reach the final episodes, Sailor and Junah's reconciliation, such as it is, doesn't come with a magical reset button. Instead, it comes with boundaries, difficult conversations, and a shared commitment to doing better for Raya than their parents did for them. There's a final, beautifully understated scene where the three of them visit a modest cafe, ironically reminiscent of their old dream, and you can see that the future ahead of them will be far from perfect. Money will still be an issue, trust will still occasionally falter, the ghosts of the past will still visit on sleepless nights. But they sit together, share food, laugh at Raya's jokes, and when a rainstorm starts outside, Junah offers Sailor the one umbrella they have, a quiet reverse image of that night years ago when they parted in the rain with nothing between them and the downpour. This time, they stand under it together, shoulders touching but not clinging, and it's that image, rather than any grand kiss or declaration, that lingers. In the end, Dendam yang Berubah jadi Cinta isn't really asking whether love can survive lies and accidents and years of separation. It's asking whether we're brave enough to rewrite the stories we've told ourselves about why we were hurt and who we need to become so we're never hurt like that again. It knows that revenge is often just grief wearing armor, and it watches, patiently, as that armor becomes too heavy to carry, as its characters slowly peel it off, piece by jagged piece, to reveal bruised, vulnerable hearts that still, somehow, want to reach for each other. For all its melodramatic flourishes, what stays with you after the credits roll isn't the accident or the shouting matches, it's the quieter truths, the way Sailor's hands shake when she first hears Raya call Junah, Arya, the way Junah looks at his reflection in a dark window and doesn't quite recognize the hardened man staring back, the way both of them, in separate rooms, confess to themselves that they never really stopped loving the person they've spent years trying to forget. If you've ever made a choice you thought was for someone's good and then spent years wondering if you destroyed something beautiful in the process, this series will probably hit closer to home than you'd like. And that, I think, is its real achievement. Beneath the twists and the time jumps and the dramatic confrontations, Dendam yang Berubah jadi Cinta tells a very simple, very human story about how easy it is to hurt the people we love when we're trying to protect them, and how hard, but how necessary, it is to find our way back, not to who we were, because that version of us died in the accident, in the breakup, in the lie, but to who we can become when we finally let love and truth sit in the same room, even if that room is small and messy and full of old debts waiting to be paid in something much more valuable than money. And when you step back from the whirlwind of Sailor and Junah's story, once that last image of them under the shared umbrella fades from your mind, you start to realize just how carefully Dendam yang Berubah jadi Cinta has been constructed to sneak up on you. It sets itself up like a simple revenge romance, then, almost without you noticing, slowly turns into a meditation on responsibility, class, and forgiveness. And that's one of the reasons this series sticks to your ribs long after you're done watching it. What's really fascinating is how the show constantly asks you to shift your loyalties. In the beginning you're firmly on Sailor's side, because the camera and the script pull you into her world of cramped rooms and overdue bills and that constant buzzing anxiety that comes from knowing one wrong step can collapse your entire life. And then, when the breakup and the accident happen, the emotional weight swings sharply toward Junah, the guy left behind with a shattered body and a story that makes him the hero in his own mind and the victim of someone else's greed. Years later, when he returns with all that success and simmering anger, the audience doesn't get to sit safely on one character's side. We're asked, scene by scene, to understand how both of them ended up where they are. That choice, to deny us an easy moral anchor, is what makes the experience feel so adult, even though it's wrapped in the tropes of a drama. Think about how often in melodramas you're handed an evil ex, or a selfish parent, as an easy outlet for your outrage. Dendam yang Berubah jadi Cinta refuses to make it that simple. Sailor's father is weak and irresponsible, yes, but when he tries to explain how he started borrowing just to keep the family afloat, just to keep food on the table, you see how gradually survival turned into addiction, and the show doesn't excuse him but it does humanize him. Junah's mother is harsh and controlling, but when she breaks down and admits she spent nights in the hospital begging God not to take her son, you understand why clinging to him so tightly made her push Sailor away. Even the debt collectors, who could have so easily been stock villains, are shown as part of a larger machine, men who have their own quotas, their own families to feed, their own bosses breathing down their necks, and that nuance matters, because it feeds into the central idea that the real antagonist here isn't any one person, it's a system. A web of expectations and obligations that crushes anyone who doesn't fit into its narrow definition of stability. When you watch Sailor sit at a table with a calculator and a pen, adding up numbers that never quite meet, you feel a pressure that has nothing to do with romantic heartbreak and everything to do with living in a world where poverty is treated like a personal failure instead of a structural reality. That pressure is what pushes her to make the choice she makes with Junah, and the series keeps circling back to that. It's as if the writers are saying, yes, she lied, yes, she hurt him, but ask yourself, who built the world where that lie felt like her only option? And this is where the drama quietly becomes social commentary without ever stopping the flow of its story. You see it in the contrast between Sailor's side of town and Junah's, in the way their friends talk, in the difference between their families' expectations. Junah's parents, while not rich, assume he'll go to university, get a decent job, maybe start a business. Sailor's world is full of people who are just hoping to hang on to whatever work they can get, who see education as a luxury if it doesn't translate immediately into money. When Sailor's father signs that first disastrous loan, it's not because he's evil, it's because the system doesn't give someone like him access to anything but predatory terms, and the show keeps that detail in the background as Sailor pays the price. Even in the present, when Junah has become a symbol of success, the series questions what that success has cost him: long hours, a hardened heart, a disconnect from his own youth. There's a really telling scene where one of his employees makes a mistake on a pitch, and Junah rips into him in a way that feels overly harsh, only to catch himself afterward and realize he's become the kind of boss his younger self would have despised. That self-awareness, even though it's fleeting at first, lets you see that his revenge on Sailor is really part of a larger pattern. He's been lashing out at everyone who falls short of the impossible standards he's set, standards born from that single formative moment where a girl told him his dreams weren't enough. The show almost suggests that his entire career is one long, furious rebuttal to those words, and there's something tragic in that, because it means his success, from his car to his office to the respect he commands, isn't just about passion or ambition. It's built on pain, on proving someone wrong instead of building something for its own sake. On the flip side, Sailor's resilience is tinged with shame. All those years of doing it alone, of playing both mother and father to Raya, have made her strong, yes, but also deeply suspicious of help, allergic to the idea of leaning on somebody again. There's this strong moment earlier in the present timeline where a well-meaning coworker offers to lend her some money when she looks stressed about an unexpected expense, and she snaps, almost hysterically, "Akan gak mau utang lagi, I don't want any more debt," and the coworker backs off, confused, because he has no idea that to Sailor, debt isn't just a number, it's the monster that ate her youth. That visceral reaction colors all of her interactions with Junah in the present. When he initially tries to help by offering to pay Raya's school fees or give them a better place to live, she pulls back, not out of pride alone, but out of genuine trauma. To her, money given by someone you love always comes with hooks, with a price you don't see until it's too late, and the narrative respects that fear even as it challenges her to see that not every gesture is a trap. Cinematically, one thing I really appreciate is how the series uses visual motifs to symbolize these emotional transformations. For example, motorbikes and roads are a recurring image. In their youth, riding together on Junah's bike is pure freedom for Sailor. It's the closest she ever gets to flying above her circumstances, zooming through the city with her arms wrapped around his waist, laughing into the wind. That same bike becomes the instrument of his near-death, the last thing she sees before the truck hits, and in the years after, she refuses to get on a bike at all. There's a brief, almost throwaway scene where a coworker offers her a ride and she declines, choosing a longer walk in the heat instead, and the camera lingers for a beat on his bike as she walks away, a silent nod to the trauma she still carries. Only much later, in one of the most symbolically rich moments near the end, does she finally accept a ride from Junah again, this time with Raya between them, and the way the scene is shot, wide shot of three silhouettes against the fading light, the city stretching out ahead, turns that simple act into a massive step toward healing. The road, which once led them to disaster, is now something they face together, and that's how the series likes to operate, big emotions, expressed through small, grounded choices. The rain, too, is practically its own character. It's raining during their breakup, raining during the accident, raining during some of their worst confrontations, as if the sky itself is echoing their inner turbulence. But the final rain, the one with the umbrella, is different. It's softer, gentler, and instead of being soaked and separated, they are covered and close, changed but not drowned. These repeating patterns give the story a satisfying cohesion, like the visuals are quietly telling you, we've been here before, but look how much is different now. The sound design works in a similarly layered way. The hospital scenes, for example, are intentionally noisy, full of beeping machines, echoing footsteps, muffled announcements, and yet, when Sailor discovers Junah's empty bed, everything drops into an almost eerie quiet except for her shaky breathing. It's a sonic representation of that feeling when the world goes on but your personal universe has just split in two. Later, office scenes in Junah's company are full of the clicking of keyboards, buzz of fluorescent lights, and the low murmur of corporate chatter, a constant hum that serves as the background noise to his revenge, which, let's be honest, initially looks very much like standard high-pressure management. Only when he starts to soften do we hear more natural sounds slip in, birds from an open window, the distant laughter of employees when he jokes with them, Raya's giggles echoing down a hallway, and you start to realize how his world, once cold and sterile, is being warmed up by the very people he tried to keep at arm's length. Musically, that recurring theme I mentioned earlier doesn't just underscore romantic moments, it sometimes plays lightly under scenes where Sailor is simply existing with Raya, cooking, helping with homework, patching uniforms, and that choice blurs the line between the old love story and the new one. The series is quietly insisting that Sailor and Junah's connection didn't end when they broke up, it lived on in their child, in bedtime stories and lullabies, and the way Sailor still flinches when a song they used to like comes on the radio. That's one of the things that makes their eventual reconnect feel so organic. It's not like love comes roaring back out of nowhere, it's that it was never really gone, it just changed shape, went underground, waited for a safer time to resurface. Now, no discussion of this series would be complete without diving into how it portrays revenge itself, because, honestly, most shows that toss Dendam into the title go big and theatrical with it, elaborate schemes, public humiliations, the kind of over-the-top plotting you either roll your eyes at or secretly enjoy. Dendam yang Berubah jadi Cinta takes a different, arguably braver approach. It treats revenge as a slow poison, something Junah drinks in small doses every day through his choices, his sarcasm, his tightly controlled cruelty, and then quietly shows you how that poison seeps into parts of his life that have nothing to do with Sailor. His friendships suffer. There's this co-worker or best friend character, let's call him Dika, who has known Junah since before the accident, and you see their relationship fray as Junah becomes more and more consumed by his need to win against Sailor. Dika confronts him at one point, telling him that making Sailor uncomfortable at work isn't going to rewrite the past, and Junah snaps back something like, "You weren't the one left to rot while she walked away," and that moment is crucial, because it exposes the lie underneath Junah's revenge. He acts as if he was a passive victim, but the truth is, he's been choosing to stay angry, choosing to stoke that fire, long after it could have gone out. The show doesn't excuse that, but it does patiently unpack where it comes from. Likewise, we see Sailor engaging in a subtler form of revenge against herself. She refuses joy, refuses help, punishes herself for things that, in many ways, weren't her fault, and that self-directed anger is just as corrosive as Junah's outward-directed rage. There's a heartbreaking scene where she's offered a promotion at work, something that could genuinely improve her and Raya's lives, and she almost turns it down because she feels undeserving, because in her mind she's still the girl who ruined Junah's life, and only when she starts to forgive herself can she accept that opportunities don't have to come with punishment attached. So when the title promises that this, Dendam, will turn into Cinta, it's not talking about some cute enemies to lovers trope, it's describing a much messier transformation, the slow realization that holding on to hurt only guarantees that you stay bound to it. Both Sailor and Junah have to choose, individually and together, to stop letting the worst thing that happened between them define every interaction they have. And crucially, the show never suggests that forgiveness means forgetting. They remember everything, the accident, the words, the absence. What changes is the lens through which they look at those memories. One of my favorite late series scenes has them sitting on a bench outside a school while Raya is inside at an event. They are both quiet, watching parents go in and out, and Junah finally asks, softly, "Kalau kita nggak bisa waktu itu, kamu pikir hidup kita bakal jauh lebih bahagia?" If we hadn't broken up back then, do you think our lives would have been much happier? And Sailor, after a long pause, replies, "Akan nggak tahu. Mungkin kita cuma bakal bawa luka yang lain, I don't know. Maybe we would have just carried different wounds," and that answer is so painfully honest. It doesn't romanticize some alternate reality, it acknowledges that life was always going to be hard for them in one way or another, and the point isn't to go back and fix the past, it's to decide what to do with the time they have left. In that way, the series quietly deflates the fantasy of, if only, that idea that one different choice would have made everything perfect. Instead, it offers something more grounded. Even with everything that's happened, it might still be worth showing up for each other now. Now let's talk performances a bit more, because the emotional heft of all this could have collapsed if the actors weren't up to the task. The actress playing Sailor brings an extraordinary physicality to the role. Watch her posture across timelines. In the flashbacks, she's loose, shoulders back, often leaning into Junah or flopping down on motorbike seats and cafe chairs with the boneless ease of someone who still believes in tomorrow. In the present, her body is always a little tense, like she's expecting a blow. Even when she smiles, her shoulders are slightly hunched, her arms often folded protectively across her chest or occupied with some task, stirring a pot, sorting papers, tying Raya's shoes, as if she doesn't know what to do with stillness anymore. Only in the final stretch, after she begins the painful process of reopening lines of communication with Junah and allowing him to co-parent, do you see that defensive shell crack? There's one beautiful moment where she's watching Raya and Junah build something out of cheap plastic blocks on the floor, and she's not doing anything, no chores, no multitasking, just sitting and watching, and for the first time in ages, her body looks at rest. It's a tiny, wordless beat, but it speaks volumes about her arc, from constant survival mode to cautiously allowing herself to simply exist in a room where support is present. On the other hand, the actor playing Junah uses his eyes as his main weapon. In the past, they are bright, playful, sometimes a little fiery when he talks about his dreams, but always full of light. Post-accident, in the business world, they are sharp, cold, scanning, like he's always on the lookout for the next betrayal or weakness. When he first sees Sailor again in that office, the way his eyes flash, shock, hurt, anger, calculation, all in a matter of seconds, is a masterclass in micro-acting. Over time, as he spends more moments with Raya, those eyes soften, you literally see the rage losing its grip as confusion, tenderness, and regret move in. There's a powerful late episode scene where he watches Raya struggle with a school project and instinctively kneels down to help her, guiding her hands, and his face shifts from concentrated teaching to an almost childlike joy when she finally gets it right, and in that instant, the mask he's worn for years just falls. The camera holds on that expression a little longer than normal, as if saying, this is the Junah that might have been all along if he hadn't been derailed, and you get this bittersweet sense of both loss and possibility. Some supporting characters deserve special mention too, because they act as emotional catalysts rather than just background noise. Dika, Junah's friend, is not just comic relief, he's a moral mirror, always nudging Junah to examine his motives, sometimes failing, sometimes succeeding. There's a key scene where Dika finally lays it out bluntly. Lo selalu ingomong lo bensi sailor, tapi tiap hari lo mikirin gimana cara biking dia njera sa bersala. Carlo benabena bensi, kenapa lo ngak tinggalin aja. You keep saying you hate Sailor, but every day you think of new ways to make her feel guilty. If you really hated her, why don't you just leave her alone? And that line is like a slap, because it names what's been obvious to us, hate is just love rearranged, and Junah's obsession proves he's never really stopped caring. On Sailor's side, there might be a close friend, maybe a neighbor or co-worker, who plays the role of occasional confidant, someone who keeps urging her to tell Raya the truth about her father and to stop assuming that she alone gets to decide what sacrifices are necessary. These side characters keep the story from becoming too insular, they voice the questions the audience is asking, they push against the protagonist's worst instincts, and they offer glimpses of more ordinary lives where love and hurt play out in quieter, less catastrophic ways. Culturally, one of the reasons this series hits so hard is because it touches on that specific, unspoken etiquette around suffering that exists in many Asian contexts, the expectation that you should endure silently, that airing your pain is selfish, that parents' decisions, no matter how destructive, must be borne by the children without complaint. Sailor is the poster child for that mentality. She swallows her resentment toward her father for years, she swallows her desire to fight back against Junah's family's accusations, she swallows the urge to reach out to Junah again and again, always telling herself that enduring is the noble thing. The series slowly dismantles that idea, showing the toll it takes not just on her, but on Raya, who grows up in a love that is, yes, warm, but also shaped by unfinished business. It makes you think about how many families in real life are quietly bearing similar secrets, children who never knew why one parent disappeared, parents who never explained the full context of a breakup or a financial collapse, scars that get passed down but never named. And that's why, for many viewers, watching Sailor and Junah finally sit down and talk, not shout, not accuse, but really talk, was cathartic in a way that went beyond, I ship them. It felt like watching your own parents have the conversation you always wished they'd had, or maybe watching a version of yourself finally put words to things you've kept bottled up. In terms of impact, you can see how the show rippled through online spaces. People shared clips of key scenes with captions like, "This is why communication matters," or "Stop making decisions for other people for their own good," or "Generational debt isn't just about money," and that tells you the series did more than entertain. It gave people language and images for feelings they already had. There were heated debate threads. Was Sailor's choice to break Junah's heart justified? Should Junah have the right to be angry about Raya being hidden from him even after understanding the circumstances? Was his revenge ever really about justice, or always about ego? And interestingly, the more people discussed, the more the lines blurred. Some argued that Sailor was a hero, others that she was selfish, some thought Junah's rage was completely understandable, others thought he went too far. The best stories live in that tension, where you can argue both sides because both sides are fully realized, and Dendam yang Berubah jadi Cinta absolutely lives there. One thing the show does particularly well, and that has big implications when we think about media representation, is the way it frames single motherhood. Sailor is never romanticized as some angelic, selfless martyr, nor is she portrayed as a cautionary tale who must be rescued by the return of a male provider. She's complex, exhausted, sometimes irritable with Raya, occasionally making mistakes, but always trying. When Junah steps in later and begins to share the load, the series treats that not as a rescue, but as a correction, a long overdue balancing of responsibilities. Raya doesn't suddenly start doing better in school or smiling more just because her father is now present. We see that she was loved and cared for even before, and what she gains is not a savior but an extra source of stability and affection. That's a subtle but important distinction, because too often stories either pedestal single parents as saintly or portray them as incomplete until a partner appears. Here, the narrative respects the life Sailor built without Junah, even as it acknowledges that, emotionally, something was missing, for Sailor, for Junah, and especially for Raya, who deserved to know both sides of herself. Speaking of Raya, her arc is deceptively simple but deeply affecting. Children in dramas often exist to cry at the right time or to say precocious things, but here she's given a consistent personality, curious, slightly older than her years in some ways, but also very much a kid who likes silly cartoons and gets cranky when she's tired. The moment when she learns the truth about her parentage is not staged as some big, operatic reveal, it's intimate, awkward, full of half-finished sentences. Sailor stumbles through an explanation, Junah sits there looking like he'd rather take a dozen motorbike crashes than see the confusion in his daughter's eyes, and Raya, in that raw way kids have, asks the one question they've both been dreading, kalau kalian sailing sayang, kenapa aku harus lahir di tengah perpisahan? If you loved each other, why did I have to be born in the middle of a separation? There's no satisfying answer to that, and the show doesn't try to invent one. Instead, it lets the silence sit heavy, then shows them choosing, in the days that follow, to prove with actions what they can't justify with words. That choice, focusing on what they'll do now rather than endlessly litigating the past, is the real hinge of the narrative. And that might be the biggest takeaway of all, that love, in this context, is less about grand gestures and more about showing up, consistently, especially when it's uncomfortable. From a purely filmmaking perspective, the series' decision to stretch time, to linger in those post-reveal, pre-reconciliation episodes where not much plot happens, but a lot of emotional recalibration does, is a risk that pays off. You see Junah learning how to exist in Raya's world, not as some drop-in Santa Claus, but as a real parent, attending school meetings, struggling with the absurd bureaucracy of education systems, realizing that being a father means being present for the boring stuff too. You see Sailor watching him bond with their daughter and battling a new kind of jealousy, not because Raya loves him, but because he's getting to experience joys she hoarded and burdens she bore alone, and she has to adjust to truly sharing parenthood after so long. These domestic, almost mundane scenes might seem slow compared to the high drama of accidents and confrontations, but they are where the titles promise fully blooms. The revenge plot is over by then. What we're watching is the painstaking, everyday work of building something resembling a family from the wreckage. Looking at pacing in more technical terms, the series follows a kind of emotional three-act structure. The first act builds the bond and breaks it with the accident, the second marinates in resentment and missed chances, and the third is about reckoning and reconfiguration. What's unusual is how the show resists the temptation to spike the third act with a fresh twist. There's no surprise new lover barging in at the last second, no extra accident to re-traumatize everyone. The climax is emotional, not event-driven. It's that bench conversation outside the school, or the quiet signing of a shared custody agreement, or the scene where Sailor finally visits the site of Junah's accident with him and they stand there, side by side, acknowledging that this intersection used to represent the end of everything, and now, somehow, it's just another place in the city, heavy but no longer sacred. That kind of climax is harder to pull off, because it requires the audience to be invested not in what will happen, but in how will they feel, and Dendam yang Berubah jadi Cinta earns that investment by doing the groundwork early, building characters you don't just root for, but recognize. In terms of criticism, if we're being fair, there are choices that might not land for everyone. Some viewers felt that Junah's corporate success came a little too easily, that the jump from injured, heartbroken young man to powerful businessman could have used more concrete detail. We get glimpses of his hustle, but not always the specifics of how he built his empire, and for audiences who love the nitty-gritty of career progression, that might feel like a missed opportunity. Others thought some of the side characters, like potential love interests introduced late in the game to create temporary jealousy, were underdeveloped, existing more as plot devices than full people. These are valid points, and they speak to the balancing act the show is trying to do. It wants to be both a big, sweeping emotional saga and a grounded social drama, and at times it leans more heavily into one at the expense of the other. For me, though, even those slightly weaker elements don't break the spell, because at its core, the series never loses sight of what matters, the evolving interior lives of its central trio. Every time the plot risks becoming too soapy, it reels itself back in with a line of dialogue that cuts close to the bone or a look between Sailor and Junah that reminds you that these are two people with a history too dense to reduce to tropes. Thinking about where this show fits in the broader landscape of romantic dramas, especially in Southeast Asia, it's interesting how it both uses and subverts familiar templates. You've got the class difference, the fated lovers, the accident, the secret child, these are staples. But instead of playing them purely for shock and tears, Dendam yang Berubah jadi Cinta treats them almost like given circumstances, a setup for deeper questions about autonomy and blame. If you compare it to something like the more formulaic telenovelas or K-dramas where the secret child plot is often dragged out solely for maximum gasp factor, what stands out here is the emphasis on the aftermath. Yes, the reveal is dramatic, but the show is more interested in what co-parenting looks like after that reveal, in how a child processes the sudden appearance of a parent, in how two adults who once broke each other's hearts learn to speak without flinching at every scar. It's less concerned with, will they or won't they get back together, and more with, even if they do, who will they be to each other now? And that's a very 2025 kind of question, in a media environment where audiences are increasingly savvy about romantic narratives, where we've all seen the grand gestures and now crave stories that acknowledge the bureaucratic, logistical, and emotional labor that follows those gestures. By the time the final episode fades out, you're not left with a sugar high of fairy tale satisfaction, you're left with a quieter, more thoughtful fullness, the sense that these characters will continue living, fighting, loving, messing up, long after the camera has cut away. So when I think about Dendam yang Berubah jadi Cinta as a whole, what really lingers is this: it's a show that believes in second chances, but not in a naive, love conquers all way. It believes in hard-won second chances, the kind you only get after you've looked unflinchingly at the damage you've caused and still chosen to stay in the room. It believes that people can grow, but that growth often looks like admitting you were wrong when you were convinced you were right. It believes that parents owe their children the truth, even when that truth is messy and unflattering. And ultimately, it believes that revenge, satisfying as it might feel in the short term, is a lonely place to live, especially when there's a little girl out there who shares your eyes and your laugh and is quietly waiting for you to choose something better. Watching this story unfold, with all its rain and regret and slowly thawing hearts, you can't help but reflect on your own grudges, your own, if only, moments, and maybe, just maybe, wonder what would happen if you allowed a little more love into spaces that have been occupied by anger for too long. That's the power of a series like this when it's done well. It doesn't just entertain you, it holds up a mirror, fogged with all the breath of its characters' confessions, and asks, very gently, is there someone you need to call? Is there a truth you need to tell? Is there a revenge you're ready to let go of, so something softer has room to grow? And if a piece of storytelling can get you to ask those questions on a random night after binge-watching, then, melodrama or not, it's doing something right. There are love stories that make you swoon, and then there are love stories that leave a bruise on your heart, the kind you keep pressing just to remind yourself it was real, and Dendam yang Berubah jadi Cinta is absolutely that kind of experience, because it doesn't open with flowers or flirty meet-cuties, it opens with a feeling, that cold, heavy realization that sometimes love isn't what breaks you. It's everything circling love like sharks: money, pride, family, shame, the kind of debt that doesn't just sit on paper but squats inside a house and eats the air. And from the very first stretch of this 2025 drama, you can almost taste how trapped Sailor feels, how every breath costs her something, and how Junah, sweet, earnest, stubborn in the way only someone truly in love can be, has no idea that the person he trusts most is about to become the person who destroys him, not because she stops loving him, but because she loves him so hard she thinks she has to make herself the villain to save him. And if that sounds like it would be frustrating, it is, but it's also painfully human, because people rarely do the wrong thing for no reason. They do it because they are panicking, because they are protecting somebody, because they are convinced there's no other door out of the room. And this story lives inside that panic and refuses to let you look away. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, let's settle into this one properly, because Dendam yang Berubah jadi Cinta arrived in 2025 at a time when audiences are kind of exhausted by romance that feels like it was manufactured in a lab, perfect lighting, perfect misunderstandings, perfect reconciliation. And what this film does differently, at least in spirit, is that it tries to make love feel expensive, like something paid for in installments, with interest, with late fees, and with a debt collector banging on the door at the worst possible moment. And even if you've seen stories about separation and reunion before, the specific emotional recipe here hits hard: a breakup built on a lie, an accident that almost turns grief into a permanent condition, years of silence that rot into resentment, and then that classic fate-driven collision where two people who still know each other's faces better than their own have to pretend they're strangers, not because it's safer, but because it's the only way they know how to stand upright without collapsing. The premise, on paper, is simple and basically heartbreaking. Sailor is burdened by her father's debt, and the weight of it corners her into ending her relationship with Junah through a painful lie, something sharp enough to make him stop chasing, something cruel enough that he'll hate her rather than keep reaching for her. But Junah, being Junah, doesn't accept it. He tries to go after her, tries to demand the truth, tries to pull the mask off the situation, and that chase ends with him nearly dying in an accident, an event that in a lesser movie would just be melodrama fuel, but here it's more like a scar stamped into the timeline, the exact moment their lives split into, before and after, and then the story leaps forward to the part that hurts in a quieter, more adult way. Years later, Sailor is raising their child alone, carrying motherhood like both a blessing and a sentence, while Junah returns as a man with glittering success, the kind that makes people assume he's invincible. Now, like money and achievement can cauterize the past, and fate, because fate always has perfect timing, pushes them back into the same frame, forcing all the old wounds, hidden truths, and unfinished feelings to flare up like they never went out at all. What I love about the setup is that it understands something brutally real: time doesn't erase love, it just changes the shape of the pain around it, and when you reunite with someone you never truly got over, it's not like pressing play through again. Half-truths, it's like walking into a house that burned down years ago and finding one identity still intact, and then even when you want to tell the truth, you don't know how to exist as someone who doesn't lie anymore, suddenly you're not older or wiser, because it means Sailor isn't just afraid of Junah's reaction. She's afraid of her own transformation. Context matters because the 2025 audiences have become extremely fluent in tropes, and the only way a story like this lands is if the emotions feel earned and the characters feel like they are making choices for reasons that make sense. Junah's side of that is equally messy, because the film makes it clear that his success story isn't purely inspirational. It's partly fueled by Sailor's pressure before it shows you her lie. It makes you feel the claustrophobia of a family obligation that because applause feels like proof that you were worth loving, and it's devotion not as a perfect romantic accessory but as a genuine force that can be dangerous when shattering his desperation, because chasing someone who's trying to disappear can turn heroic into reckless very fast, and that's risky because if the acting isn't there, makes those close-ups become not as punishment, but when it works, not as cheap shock, it's devastating, but as the logical end because you watch a smile falling in opposite directions while someone swallow words like their poison. You watch ice hard about how the story unfolds without the camera giving your experience with full spoilers there, like because the pleasure here you're going to slow reveal of why Sailor does what she does. There's also a recurring contrast between public spaces and love can survive the versions of us we become when we're trying to survive everything else. They're performing adulthood. In the early stretch, we're dropped into a relationship that feels lived in ways, little routines, and that contrast familiar is what makes their relationship feel real. And Sailor don't just love each other, they rely on each other as a kind of trust enough to be ugly. And then the shadow creeps in, and the tragedy is that their trust is broken even as their intimacy remains, but it's treated as
The
something
soundtrack and
corrosive,
sound
like a
design
stain that spreads
do a
through
lot of heavy
conversations
lifting
and
and
forces
forces
a sailor
scenes.
into secrecy.
Sometimes the
into
absence of
calculation
music is the point,
into that
leaving
terrible
you with
math
only the
where every
ambient
option,
noise of life,
traffic,
costs someone
distant
you
voices,
love,
and you have to
kettle,
choose which
door
pain you
closing,
can tolerate. And that mundanity makes
The
the
breakup
pain feel
itself
sharper,
is staged
like
like an
heartbreak
execution.
isn't always
Sailor
dramatic.
doesn't just say,
Sometimes it's
"We're
just
done."
sitting at
She
a table
weaponizes a
pretending
line
you're
designed
fine
to make
while the
Junah
world
question
keeps
the
making
entire
normal
relationship
sounds around to make him feel foolish for
Now,
trusting
if
her.
you're the type
Because
of
if
viewer
he's
who
angry
watches
enough,
romance for
maybe he'll
comfort,
stop
this
coming.
movie might
Maybe
feel
he'll
like
stop
it's
calling.
holding comfort
Maybe he'll
hostage
stop trying
because
to
it's
save
more
her.
interested
And the
in
tragedy
tension
is
than
that she's
tenderness
not
for
doing
long
it
stretches.
because she's
But
cold.
when it
She's
finally
doing it
allows
because
tenderness
she's
to
terrified.
surface,
And
hits
terror
harder
turns
precisely
people
because
into
actors
actors
in their own
like
lives,
water in a
reading
desert.
lines
There are moments where you see
hate
the
because
old
they
version
think
of
the
them,
alternative
the
is
version that
worse.
laughed easily. The
Junah's
version that
reaction
didn't have
is
to think
exactly
before
what you'd
touching each
expect
other.
from someone
And those
who's in love
flashes
and
are
blindsided. So
disbelief
bittersweet
first,
because you
then
realize that
bargaining,
version
then
didn't
that
die because
frantic
they
pursuit
stopped
where
loving
he's
each other.
trying to
It
catch
died
up to the
because
moment
life
he
got
missed,
its hands
and the
on
film
them.
captures that frantic
And then
energy
the
with a
film
sense
starts
of
asking a darker
inevitability,
question
like the
beneath
world
the
is
romantic
narrowing,
one.
like
What
the
if
road
love
is
isn't
running
enough
out,
to make
and
someone
then the
stay?
accident hits,
And what if
and the
staying isn't
emotional
always the
temperature
healthiest
changes.
choice anyway?
Because
Suddenly,
sometimes
it's
the
not
most
just
loving
about
thing is to
heartbreak.
separate.
It's about
Not because you
mortality,
hate each
about
other,
guilt,
but because
about the
together
kind
you
of
become
if
worse
only
people.
that can poison
And that
every
tension
future
sits right
decision.
at the heart of the verdict.
Without getting
the film
too
is
graphic,
steering toward.
the near-death
Because
moment
it wants
is
you to
treated
want
as a
them
pivot.
together while
It becomes
also
the
fearing
reason
what
the
togetherness
life
means
hardens
into silence. The
Unleash.
reason Sailor's disappearance becomes
Supporting
permanent,
characters,
and the
depending
reason
on how
Junah's
much
love,
you pay
while
attention,
soft,
function
begins to
like mirrors
calcify
and pressure
into something
points.
else.
People who
Resentment,
encourage Junah's
vengeance,
resentment
that
because it
Dendam,
benefits them.
promised in
People
the
who
title,
encourage
not
Sailor
necessarily
secrecy
because
because
they're
they're
afraid
afraid
of
where
scandal.
someone twirls
People
a
who offer
mustache,
small
but the real
kindnesses that
kind,
keep Sailor
where you're
afloat.
successful
And
not
these
just
side
to
presence
thrive,
but
but
to
to
prove
prove
something
something
to
to
the
the
ghost of the
relationships
person
don't
who
exist in a vacuum.
left you
There's
bleeding on
always
the
a
side
chorus
of the
around the
road,
couple,
whispering
then the
advice,
time jump,
projecting
and this
values.
is where the film either
Sometimes
wins
making
you or
things
loses you depending on how much
worse.
you can handle emotional slow
And that,
burn.
to me,
Because
is
the
part
part
of
of the
the
cultural
cultural
impact
impact
of
of
a
a
story
story
like
She's
this.
tougher
It
in the
taps
way
into
single
how
parents often
communities judge
become,
women
like the
differently
world
than
has
men
taught her that
breakup
softness
narratives.
is a luxury,
How a
and the
successful
child,
man is
who
praised
is,
as resilient
crucially,
while a
their
struggling
child,
woman is
functions
pitied
as
or
both
blamed.
the sweetest
How
thread
motherhood
of connection
changes
and
the
the
way
most
society
volatile
reads a
secret in the
woman's
story.
choices, and how shame is
And I want
often
to pause on
distributed
that,
unevenly.
because
Because stories like this can
but
sometimes
doesn't
turn
treat the
into
kid
a
as a
lecture
twist,
about that.
as a prop
But you
you can
pull out
feel
of
it
a
in the
box
way
to force
Sailor
the
is
couple
forced
back
to manage
together.
not just
But what
her
works
emotions,
here is the
but
way the
everyone
child's
else's
perception
perception
is
of her.
tied
And
directly
that
to
added
Sailor's
burden
makes
solitude.
her life
She
feel
isn't just hiding a
simultaneously
fact,
more
she's
unforgivable
living a
and more
life
understandable,
understandable,
protecting
which is
someone
exactly
who
the
didn't
kind
ask
of
to be
moral
born
friction
into a
that
war
keeps
of adult
people
taunting after the
consequences.
watch. Meanwhile,
And yes,
Junah
people
returns,
will talk,
and the film
because
paints
this is
his
the kind of
success with a double edge.
2025 release
Yes,
that
it's
thrives in the
glamorous.
online
Yes,
ecosystem.
it's satisfying
Clips
to
of
see
confrontation
confrontation
scenes,
but it's also
audio
lonely,
snippets of a
because
line that
success
hits
can
too
become
close
a
to
fortress
home.
you hide
Debates
in,
about who
and when
deserves
you've built your
forgiveness,
life
edits
around
that
proving you
romanticize the
untouchable.
pain.
The last
And
thing you
counter
want
edits
is
that
for the
call out
person who
toxic
once broke
behavior.
you to
And
walk
I
back
can
in and
already
touch the
imagine
bruise you
viewers
from
from
different
didn't
backgrounds
exist.
hearing different parts
Their
of the story.
reunion
Is the
louder.
kind of
Some
scene that
hearing,
makes you hold
family
your breath
duty,
without
some
realizing
hearing,
it. Emotional manipulation.
It's not
Some
fireworks.
hearing, it's tension, survival,
Some
it's
hearing
recognition
in a split
cowardice,
second,
and all of those
like two
readings
men
can
snapping
coexist
toward
because
each
the
other
story
and
is
then
built
forcing
on
contradictions.
contradictions. The
It's the
question
way
of
a
pain
name
sounds
sounds
back
different
again
when
when
it's
we
spoken
reach the
after
later
years.
turns, because the closer
It's
the
the
truth
strange
gets to being
politeness
spoken,
people use
the more
when
the
they're
film
trying not to
compresses
scream.
time emotionally. Scenes
And
get
from there the
sharper,
film becomes
arguments
a careful
become less
dance
avoidant,
proximity.
silences
They
become
circle
more
each other in the
dangerous,
same
and the
spaces,
story starts
forced
paying
together
off
by
the tension it's been
circumstance,
collecting
by
like
mutual
interest.
connections,
And even if you
by
can
the
predict
stubbornness of
certain
unbeat,
results, history,
because let's
and every
be honest,
conversation
the
has
genre
two
has
conversations
patterns.
inside
The way
it,
it lands
what
depends
they say,
on
and
performance
what they're
and
really
tone.
saying.
And this
The
movie's
subtext
tone
that keeps leaking out
stays
no matter
remarkably
how hard
consistent,
they clamp down.
intimate,
Bruised, a little
character-wise,
fatalistic.
Sailor is
but
the
not
engine of
hopeless.
the emotional complexity.
There's a particular kind of
She's
scene,
not written
later
as a
on,
saint,
where the film
and that's
finally
important.
allows a character to say something
lies,
they've been
she
choking down
withholds,
for years,
she makes
and the
choices
power of
that it is not in the words
but the film also refuses to flatten her into a simple, misunderstood heroine, because her choices have consequences and the story makes her sit in them.
It's not a clean monologue.
You can feel that she's been carrying guilt like a second spy.
And when the story confronts the
raising a child
alone
not just as a plot point, but as a moral reckoning,
you feel the
when
full
she's
weight
on
of it,
screen,
because
there's
there's
often
often
this
this
sense
sense
that
that
she's
she's
doing
just
five
five
things
things
at
at
once
once in her
survives.
head.
They haunt
Calculating
everyone
money,
who played a
scanning
role
for
in
danger
leading
up to that
managing
moment,
emotion,
and sailor's
trying
guilt
to be a
isn't
good mother,
abstract.
trying
It's
not
tied
to
to a very
collapse.
tangible image of what could
And
have
when
happened
Junah
if fate had been
reappears,
slightly
you can
less
see her
merciful.
old self flash through her
That's
face
why
like
the
a
title's
memory,
promise
and
of
then
love
vanish
returning
behind
is
the wall
always in
again,
tension
because
with
the
the fear
wall
that
is
love
love kept
returning
her
might be
alive.
too late. Because
Junah,
time doesn't
on the
just
other hand,
pass,
is
changes
fascinating
people
because
in
his arc
irreversible
isn't simply
ways.
her
Her guide
forgiveness,
becomes cold.
if it comes,
has to
his
navigate
success
those
is
changes
convincing,
rather than
but you can
pretending
read
they
the
didn't
fragility
happen.
under it.
If I had to describe the emotional flavor of Dendam young Berubah his trust, and when someone's trust is injured, that's been sitting in the mouth too long, they heal by controlling and then suddenly sweet again when you least expect it. Dendam energy comes in is not always as unbearable, because it reminds you of what you lost. He wants to be the one who decides the terms of performances and chemistry. The one who can strongest moments are often not the loud one holding the match instead of the one where both characters are trying to pretend they feel nothing and still loves her, because human beings becomes terrible at hiding. He's angry at her, but he's also angry at himself for still wanting her. He wants answers, but he's terrified of what the answers will do to him. He wants to punish her, but every time he sees her struggle, something in him softens, and that softness makes him furious because it feels like losing. The father's death, which could have been a one-note villain detail, becomes more like a symbol of inherited burden, the way parents' mistakes spill into their children's lives like floodwater. Depending on how you read the story, the father is either a cautionary figure, a man whose choices create a trap, or a tragic one, someone crushed by his own circumstances who drags everyone down without meaning to. Either way, his death is the fuse that lights the entire emotional explosion, and the film doesn't let you forget that poverty and obligation can be as decisive as any romance, that sometimes the antagonist is not a person but a system of pressure that makes decent people do ugly things. And then there's the child, the quiet center of gravity. The film uses the child not just to raise stakes, but to explore what love looks like when it's no longer just about two people's feelings. Because when a child exists, every argument becomes dangerous. Every secret becomes heavier. Every reunion is no longer romantic by default, it's terrifying, because it can rearrange an entire life. Without spoiling the exact sequence of reveals, the story gradually tightens the knot around what Junah knows, what he suspects, and what Sailor is willing to admit, and the tension isn't just, will they get back together, it's, what will it cost if the truth detonates, and who will get hurt by the shrapnel. Cinematically, even if you're watching this at home, the movie aims for that big screen emotional scale, lingering close-ups when words fail, long pauses that force you to sit in discomfort, a visual language that often contrasts warmth and cold to mirror the relationship. Scenes between Sailor and Junah after the reunion tend to feel tighter, more compressed, like the air is thinner around them, whereas scenes of Sailor alone with her child open up emotionally, even if the setting is small, because there's honesty there. You can feel the film leaning into textures, the hum of a city at night, the way rain can sound like static when you're trying not to cry, the harshness of bright daylight when you'd rather hide, the intimacy of dim rooms where secrets live. The editing rhythm often mirrors the push-pull of their dynamic, moments of rapid escalation followed by stretches of quiet where you're waiting for the other shoe to drop. And the music, in a story like this, matters immensely, because the wrong score can turn genuine pain into soap opera, but when it's handled right, music becomes the language of what characters can't say. Here, the emotional peaks are underscored in a way that tries to amplify rather than instruct. It doesn't always scream at you to cry, it often just sits under the scene like a pulse, reminding you that both of these people are still alive inside, even when they are acting like stone. Thematically, Dendam yang Berubah jadi Cinta is basically a study in how love mutates under pressure. It asks whether sacrifice is still noble if it's built on deception. It asks whether a lie told to protect someone is still violence. It asks whether, moving on, is real when the past keeps showing up in your posture, in your reflexes, in the way you flinch when someone raises their voice. It also explores the very specific kind of revenge that happens when you don't want to harm the other person physically, you just want them to feel what you felt, to carry the same weight, to finally understand the depth of your wound. That's why Junah's success is emotionally loaded. It's not just a career glow-up, it's a statement. It's him saying, "You thought I would collapse without you, but I didn't," while secretly still orbiting the crater she left. And Sailor's life as a single mother becomes a different kind of statement. You left me no choice, even if she's the one who left first, even if her leaving was an act of love and fear braided together so tightly she can't separate them anymore. The title, Revenge That Turns Into Love, sounds like it might be simple, but the film complicates it by suggesting that revenge and love are not opposites, they can be siblings. They can come from the same source, attachment. If you didn't care, you wouldn't want revenge. If you didn't love, you wouldn't feel betrayal as intensely. So the question becomes not, does revenge become love, but can love survive after it's been used as a weapon, and can the people involved forgive not just each other, but themselves? Performances, speaking in the way you feel them rather than naming names, are key to selling this, because on paper, a lot of these scenes are people talking around the truth, but the actors have to make the unsaid feel louder than the said. Sailor's portrayal needs that constant undercurrent of restraint, the sense that tears are always one breath away, and Junah's portrayal needs that balance of authority and fracture, the sense that he's composed until he's not, and when he's not, it's terrifying not because he's violent, but because he's vulnerable. Their chemistry, crucially, isn't just romantic chemistry, it's history chemistry. It's the way they know how to hurt each other efficiently. It's the way they still notice small things. It's the way their bodies react before their mouths decide what to say. And the best scenes are the ones where neither of them wins. The ones where Junah thinks he's in control but a single detail knocks him off balance. The ones where Sailor tries to be firm but her voice betrays her. The ones where the child's presence forces both of them to become gentler than they want to be. Pacing-wise, this kind of story is always walking a tightrope. Move too fast and the emotions feel unearned. Move too slow and viewers start yelling at the screen, begging for a conversation that would solve everything. Dendam yang Berubah jadi Cinta mostly embraces the slow burn, and whether you enjoy that depends on your tolerance for tension and your appetite for angst. There are stretches where the film deliberately lets misunderstanding linger, not because the writers don't know how to resolve it, but because the characters are psychologically incapable of clean communication. People who have been hurt like this don't sit down and calmly share their truth, they test each other, they provoke, they retreat, they perform strength, they wait for the other person to prove they are safe, and that testing takes time. The movie understands that, and it also understands that the audience's frustration can be part of the experience. You feel irritated because you care, because you want relief, and the film keeps delaying relief the way real life does. That said, the film also knows when to feed you emotional payoff, a look held too long, an apology that almost happens, a confession that gets swallowed, a moment where a hand reaches out and then stops. Those micro-moments become the oxygen that keeps you watching, because they suggest that under all the bitterness, the original love is still there, waiting like embers. The emotional analysis I keep coming back to is how the film treats lies. In a lot of romances, lies are plot twists. Here, lies are survival strategies. Sailor lies to protect Junah from being dragged into her father's mess, but she also lies because she is ashamed, because she doesn't want him to see her powerless, because she's internalized the idea that love is conditional on being enough, and that makes her feel like she's not enough. Junah, in turn, lies to himself. He tells himself he's over it, he tells himself he's fine, he tells himself success is the same thing as healing. And when they meet again, both of them are living inside the architecture of those lies, and the film's tension comes from the slow demolition of that architecture. When truths start to surface, they don't arrive politely, they arrive like storms. And the film also doesn't let you forget that truth has timing. The same truth told at the wrong time can be cruelty. The same confession delivered too late can feel like manipulation. That's what makes the years later reveal dynamics so emotionally volatile. You're not just learning facts, you're recalculating entire histories, and the characters have to do that math in real time while still trying to function like adults. One of the most interesting cultural resonances here is how the story frames obligation. In many societies, and especially in many Asian family contexts, family debt isn't just financial, it's moral. It's identity. It's, we don't abandon our own, even when your own are dragging you into the ocean. Sailor's predicament reflects that, leaving Junah isn't just about protecting him, it's also about being unable to imagine a life where she chooses herself over her family's crisis. The film doesn't necessarily tell you she's right, but it shows you why she feels like she has no choice. And that resonates with audiences who know what it's like to carry your parents' burdens, to feel like your future is collateral, to live with the constant fear that one phone call will ruin everything. At the same time, the film also speaks to modern audiences who are increasingly questioning that kind of obligation, who are asking, why should one generation's mistakes become the next generation's prison? And that tension, between duty and selfhood, powers a lot of the emotional conflict. Audience reaction to a story like this tends to split into camps, and you can almost predict the comment sections. There are people who will defend Sailor with their whole chest, saying she did what she had to do, she sacrificed for love, She raised the child alone, she's been suffering in silence, and there are people who will drag her, saying she stole Junah's agency, she made decisions for him, she traumatized him, she could have told the truth, and both reactions are valid because the film is built to provoke exactly that moral argument. And then there are the viewers who will focus on Junah and say, I understand his anger, I understand why he wants revenge, I understand why he can't just forgive, while others will say, his resentment is suffocating, his success doesn't give him the right to control the narrative, he needs to grow up, and again, that split is a sign the characters feel real enough to argue about. That's cultural impact in the internet age, not just tears while watching, but debates afterward, people projecting their own experiences of betrayal and sacrifice onto the story, people choosing sides, people making edits, quoting lines, turning scenes into memes not because they are funny but because they are painfully relatable. And there's something almost cathartic about that, because romance stories like this become communal therapy sessions, everyone bringing their own scars to the table and seeing which character bleeds the same way they do. What makes Dendam yang Berubah jadi Cinta stick, at least emotionally, is how it treats the concept of return. Junah returns successful. Sailor returns to being faced with the past. The past returns as truth. And the question becomes, can you return to love after you've turned it into a battlefield? The film suggests that love doesn't disappear, but it can become unrecognizable. It can become transactional. It can become something you use to keep score. And healing, if it happens, is not a sparkly montage. It's slow. It's humiliating. It requires admitting you were wrong, admitting you were scared, admitting you hurt someone you didn't want to hurt. It requires letting go of the fantasy that you can redo the past cleanly. A lot of the emotional power here comes from watching two people try to negotiate that. Not in a tidy way, but in messy, jagged steps forward and backward. When they are kind to each other, it feels like sunlight breaking through cloud cover. When they are cruel, it feels like watching someone press on a bruise just to prove it's still there. And hovering over all of it is the child, the living proof that their love once created something beautiful, and also the reminder that their choices will echo into a new life. That's where the story gets genuinely wrenching, because you start to realize that the true villain might not be any one person, it might be timing, fear, pride, and the way a single lie can become a wall so tall that years later, even the truth has to climb to reach the other side. The film's best emotional trick is that it doesn't let you hate either of them completely. Even when Sailor is making you scream internally, you see her reasons. Even when Junah is acting like his pain gives him permission to be harsh, you feel the wound underneath. The story keeps reminding you that people can be both victim and perpetrator, sometimes in the same scene. That complexity is what elevates the melodrama into something closer to tragedy, because tragedy isn't bad things happen, tragedy is people make the only choices they think they have, and those choices still destroy what they love. Now, if you're wondering whether this is the kind of film that gives you a neat bow at the end, the vibe it builds suggests it's more interested in emotional truth than fairy tale closure. The verdict it offers isn't just about whether they end up together, but about what togetherness would even mean after everything. Can you rebuild trust when the foundation was cracked on purpose? Can you forgive someone who hurt you while trying to protect you? Can you forgive yourself for becoming someone you don't recognize? Those are the real questions this story leaves you with, and that's why it lingers after the credits, because you start thinking about your own life, the things you didn't say, the people you pushed away for what you thought were good reasons, the moments where pride disguised itself as strength, the times you chose silence because truth felt too dangerous. And in that sense, the title is almost like a promise and a warning. Revenge can turn into love, but love can also turn into revenge if you feed it the wrong things. So here's where I land on it, emotionally. As a viewing experience, Dendam yang Berubah jadi Cinta is designed to hurt you, but not in a cheap way, more like in a way that feels uncomfortably familiar, like the film is holding up a mirror to the ugliest parts of love, the parts where we control, where we hide, where we punish, where we self-sabotage, while still believing, stubbornly, that something tender can survive underneath all that rubble. It's not the kind of romance you watch to feel light. It's the kind you watch when you want to feel seen in your mess, when you want a story that admits love is sometimes a disaster zone and people still crawl through it looking for each other. If you're someone who hates misunderstandings, you're going to clench your jaw, because this film understands the terrible power of withheld truth. If you're someone who loves emotional slow burns and characters who feel like they have real psychological damage, you're going to be locked in, because every scene is charged with history. And if you're someone who's ever had to choose between love and survival, between honesty and safety, between your heart and your family's expectations, this story is going to hit you in a very specific place, the place where you keep the memories you don't talk about. In the end, my final feeling is this: Dendam yang Berubah jadi Cinta isn't just telling you, love conquers all, it's asking you what conquering even looks like when love has already been defeated once, when it's been buried under years of resentment and responsibility and secrets, and yet somehow it still knocks from inside the coffin, still asking to be heard, still asking, quietly, for another chance to breathe. And the longer you sit with it, the more you realize the movie isn't actually obsessed with the breakup itself, it's obsessed with the aftermath, with the way one decision can fossilize into a whole personality, because when we meet Sailor in that later timeline, she isn't just a woman raising a child, she's a woman who has built an entire internal government whose only job is to keep her from falling apart, and the film keeps showing you how exhausting that is in small, observational moments that feel almost too real, like the way her eyes flick to a phone screen and then away as if the act of hoping is dangerous, or the way she measures every expense with the kind of quiet dread that people only understand when they've lived paycheck to paycheck. And I think what makes her compelling is that the story doesn't frame her as a chess player pulling strings, it frames her as someone drowning who learned how to smile underwater so nobody would panic. And then we have Junah, whose return is this tidal shift in the atmosphere, because the movie makes sure you feel his presence before he even says anything, through the way people react to him, through the way rooms suddenly seem too small, through the way Sailor's composure tightens like a knot, and in that sense his success is not just an update on his life, it's a weaponized contrast. He can pay for problems now, he can erase discomfort with money, he can be treated with respect, and yet the one thing he can't purchase is the version of his past that didn't include betrayal, and the film quietly underlines how unfair that is, how you can win life and still be losing in the one place that matters. One of the smartest choices the story makes is that it refuses to let their reunion be a single dramatic collision followed by immediate romance sparks. Instead it treats reunion like an infection, slow, persistent, irritating, impossible to ignore, because when two people share a history that deep, they don't just speak, they trigger each other, and the movie turns that triggering into an emotional rhythm, a conversation that starts civil, then a word lands wrong, then an old memory flashes behind the eyes, then the tone changes, then the masks come back up, and you can almost hear the unspoken line in both their heads, which is, don't let them see you miss them. And this is where the revenge element becomes emotionally interesting, because it isn't about Junah plotting some grand cinematic downfall for Sailor, it's about him trying to reclaim power in the only way he knows how, by denying her access to his softness, by making her feel small the way he felt small, by controlling the narrative so he never has to be the abandoned one again. And the film plays that as both understandable and tragic, because it's not satisfying revenge, it's corrosive revenge, the kind that burns the hand holding it. There's a midsection where the movie leans into workplace and social dynamics, without turning into a totally different genre, and it uses those spaces to show how reputation can be another kind of prison. Junah is surrounded by people who admire him, who laugh a little too loudly, who treat his approval like sunlight, and Sailor is surrounded by people who either pity her or assume things about her. And those social assumptions become part of the tension, because it's one thing to fight your ex in private, it's another thing to do it while the world is watching and misunderstanding every glance. And then, threaded through all of that, the child becomes this quiet ticking clock, because every scene where Sailor is with her kid has this underlying awareness that the truth can't stay hidden forever, that time itself is pulling the secret toward daylight. And what the film does well is that it doesn't just use the child for tearjerker moments, it uses the child to force moral clarity. When adults are selfish, kids pay the bill. And the story keeps nudging you to remember that, especially in moments where Junah's anger starts to feel like it could tip into cruelty if he's not careful. There's a particular kind of ache in scenes where Sailor has to be both mother and father at once, not in the simplistic, she's so strong way, but in the practical way. She has to decide what to tell the kid about absence, she has to choose which questions to answer and which to delay, she has to carry joy and fear in the same hands, and when you watch her navigate that, you understand why she's terrified of Junah returning, because his return doesn't just threaten her heart, it threatens the Fragile stability she fought for, and stability, when you've had none, becomes addictive. The film's emotional suspense is basically built out of, almost, moments, and I mean that in the best way, almost an honest confession, almost an apology, almost a hug, almost a breakdown, almost a truth spoken out loud, and those almosts are what keep the pressure high, because you start to realize this isn't a story about one big reveal, it's about death by 1,000 withheld sentences, and that's why even quiet scenes feel loud. There's also an interesting undercurrent of physical memory, how the body remembers pain even when the mind tries to move on, and because Junah's accident was so defining, the film keeps echoing it in subtle ways, like the way he reacts to sudden danger, or how he goes still when he hears certain sounds, or how his confidence sometimes feels like overcompensation. And those details matter because they prevent his anger from looking like pure ego, it looks like a defense mechanism built on trauma. And the best romance dramas never forget that trauma is not just backstory, it's behavior. And when the story begins to peel back the hidden truths promised in the premise, it doesn't just hand you information like a wiki summary, it weaponizes timing, it lets characters discover things at the worst possible moments, it forces them to react before they've had time to process, which is exactly how real revelations work, and if you've ever had your entire understanding of a relationship rearranged by one sentence, you know that feeling of the floor shifting under you, and the film chases that feeling repeatedly, sometimes almost cruelly, like it wants to see how much emotional tension you can hold before you crack. I also want to talk about the way the movie frames Sailor's lie, because it would be very easy to treat it as a single event, a single sin, but what the story suggests is that the lie becomes a lifestyle. Once you lie at that scale, everything afterward has to be shaped around the lie to keep it from collapsing, and you end up lying in smaller ways all the time, through omission, through what matters most, a voice catches, a hand lingers, an inhale becomes a confession, and the camera notices. The writing also understands that some fights are not about the current topic, they are about the whole archive of pain underneath, so when Junah snaps at Sailor about something small, you know he's not really talking about that small thing, he's talking about being discarded, about nearly dying, about living with unanswered questions, and when Sailor snaps back, she's not just defending her current choices, she's defending the years she sacrificed, the nights she cried alone, the way she swallowed her own needs because a child needed her more. And that's where the story gets emotionally mature. It's not simply, who is right, it's, how do two wrong people stop wronging each other? Now, does the film ever risk tipping into melodrama? Sure, because the premise itself is melodramatic, debt, betrayal, near death, years later, secret child, successful return, fate reunion, it's basically a recipe that could easily become exaggerated. But what keeps it from collapsing completely into soap is the grounded emotional logic and the willingness to let scenes breathe without constantly forcing plot twists, and when it does lean into bigger moments, it usually earns them by building pressure first. That said, I can also see some viewers feeling like certain conflicts could be resolved with a single honest conversation, and they are not wrong in theory, but the film's argument is that the characters aren't capable of that kind of honesty yet, because honesty would require them to risk rejection all over again. And people who have been shattered once will choose familiar misery over uncertain healing 9 times out of 10. The cultural impact, beyond shipping and discourse, is also in how it frames single motherhood and male success in the same narrative. It forces viewers to confront how differently society rewards suffering depending on who is suffering and what that suffering produces, because Junah's suffering produces ambition and money and status, which society celebrates, while Sailor's suffering produces survival and caretaking, which society often takes for granted, and the film doesn't resolve that imbalance neatly, it just shows it, and that alone is enough to spark conversation. And then, as a romance, it asks something that I think is the most painful question of all: if you truly loved someone, why did you hurt them in the exact way they couldn't recover from? And if you were hurt that badly, why does the person who hurt you still feel like home? That's not a comfortable question, but it's honest. And that honesty is why stories like this get under people's skin. So if you're watching as someone who wants catharsis, the movie does build toward emotional release, but it's not the kind that makes everything perfect, it's the kind that makes you exhale and then realize you're still sad, just differently sad, because the point isn't to erase what happened, it's to decide what to do with it. And my overall verdict, continuing from where we left off, is that Dendam yang Berubah jadi Cinta works best when you surrender to its emotional tempo and stop expecting the characters to behave like rational problem solvers, because they are not solving a problem, they are surviving a wound, and wounds don't negotiate politely, they throb, they flare, they make you defensive, they make you cruel, and then, if you're lucky, they heal slowly, leaving scars that you carry into whatever love comes next, whether that love is with the same person or someone new. If you want a romance that feels like a warm blanket, this isn't it. But if you want a romance that feels like holding your hand too close to a flame and realizing you can't pull away because the heat is the only thing that proves you're alive, then this story delivers, and it delivers in that cinematic, emotionally immersive way that makes you pause the video afterward and just stare at your screen for a second, remembering that sometimes the most unforgettable love stories aren't about falling in love, they are about what happens when love falls apart and still refuses to die.